opportunity where we can discuss matters around local government, environmental sustainability, and especially the intersection of the two in a way that speaks to a more broader audience, not only academics. And for that reason, I'm also extremely happy to see that we've got people from industry, the private sector, and also our undergrad fraternity present here this afternoon. Perhaps just a little bit about CLES for those who may not know who we are. The chair is, and that is a very strange way of referring to a research hub, so to speak, within a university. And we specifically are situated in the Faculty of Law of the NWU, as I've mentioned. And we, as myself, as the chair holder, and I work here with a lovely team of postdoctoral fellows, doctoral students, and master's students. And collectively, we are trying to generate new knowledge and information on the challenges experienced in cities, urban areas, and specifically so in relation to what is necessary for the cities and towns in our country to be sustainable. And sustainability, even though we've got a strong emphasis on the environment, we understand to involve a lot more. It's also about balancing social, cultural, and economic interests in combination of preserving what, at least in my view, is the most critical of those issues or sectors, and that, of course, is the natural environment. And that includes the animals and the plants, but definitely also us as humans. We've got a very interesting topic on the table today, and I suppose that none of you need introduction to the energy crisis. But for me personally, something new to the discussion today is this idea of adaptive law and policy. I'm looking very much forward to Chantelle explaining to us later on what this means. And I'm especially looking forward to all of us engaging with Chantelle and with each other after her presentation. But I am not going to introduce Chantelle, and that will be done by one of our master's students and also the main organizer of today, Ledile Sekwakwa. So I'm around, but I will be switching off my camera and my mic, and I'm handing over to Ledile.
Thank you so much, Prof. At this moment, it is my privilege to introduce to you Ms. Chantelle G. Moyo. Ms. Chantelle G. Moyo is a former CLES PhD researcher, a legal practitioner, and researcher. Her research areas range from environmental law, mining law, climate change law, and energy law. She has also served as an independent consultant on these areas for organizations in South Africa and abroad, including the International Development Law Organization, Save the Children International, Southern African Resources Watch, among others. She will be speaking today on the role of adaptive law and policy in addressing the current energy crisis in South Africa. Our topic is an important one given the dire situation our country is in with relation to our national electricity supply. Rolling blackouts, often known as load shedding, a term with which we all are familiar here, have been occurring frequently in South Africa, and the local industry and economic development have suffered as a result. However, the energy crisis still exists and is likely to worsen. With that being said, solutions, new ways, or novel approaches to this problem or method of operation are thus becoming increasingly necessary. Without further delay, I would like to welcome Ms. Moyo. Ms. Moyo, we look forward to hearing your thoughts this afternoon. The floor is now yours. But before you could start, I would like to first share her slides.
While you do that, Ledile, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction and the invitation, Ms. Sekwakwa and Prof. Du Plessis. I know the planning that goes beyond putting together a successful critical conversation, and I extend my appreciation also to the team, of course, overseen by Prof. As Lidile has already mentioned, my name is Chantelle, and it is good to be back to share some thoughts on the current state of affairs in the energy sector, more specifically the electricity supply industry, and the role that adaptive law and policy has in addressing this challenge. This is definitely an area that I have grown incredibly passionate about in the last 3 years, and in which I continue to be a scholar in. Thank you, Lidile. My slides are visible. So I'm going to be speaking this afternoon on the topic titled "The Role of Adaptive Law and Policy in Addressing the Current Legal Energy Crisis in South Africa." Now, most of what I will share today is based on the doctoral study that I completed in 2022, but some insights are also from what I've gathered after that particular study. So I'll point from the very beginning that although the study was grounded in law, it also traversed other disciplines, especially political science and economics. So don't get thrown off when I start talking about political influence, economic consequences, and how these sometimes become enablers or impediments to the role that adaptive law could play in the energy sector. So my approach this afternoon, although I'll love to be theoretical, I'll take a more pragmatic approach in discussing the issue that we have currently in South Africa, which is the electricity crisis that we find ourselves in. Next slide, please, Lidile. So from the get-go, I'll start by saying that I think the beauty of what I am talking about today, as Prof. and Lidile have already mentioned, is that it's not something that's far-fetched, right? I'm talking about an issue that is close to home, that affects all of us, and that we hear about essentially on a daily basis. Now, whether one is on social media or listening to the news or a podcast or the radio even, one gets blasted and bombarded by the information that relates generally to the energy crisis, how it's worsening, and how it's essentially affecting every facet of our lives. Now, this slide shows the barrage of information that's out there concerning electricity and the challenges that we have in the sector. These challenges range from the pricing of electricity. Eskom ate my homework, as you can see from one of the newspaper articles, to concerns about reliance on renewable energy, possible reliance on renewable energy as a solution to the rolling blackouts that we face, possibility of including nuclear power more into our energy mix, and in some instances, possibilities of adjusting the way that our relationship with electricity, the way that we relate to it, to a point where we get to live beyond what the national regulator can generate at a certain time. So there's a lot of information that is being churned out by mainstream and popular media concerning the electricity crisis that we find ourselves in. Next slide, please, Lidile. So as such, I want to start off by distilling some of this information and somewhat giving an overview of the state of electricity in South Africa right now. So although I completed the study in 2022, the overview I'm going to give you is the overview from the first 100 days of 2023. Now, as of yesterday, the projection has been that 250 days I expected of load shedding in 2023. Now, this is an upward trajectory from the 200 days that we spent in 2022. And this in itself was a 200% increase from the 48 days that we spent of load shedding that we spent in 2021. So you can see essentially the upward trajectory that we are taking as so far as load shedding is concerned. Now, in 2023, also the country is projected to lose about 51 million US dollars each day to load shedding. That's about 900 million rands. So if you calculate this amount in terms of the expected days of load shedding, then you get about 12.7 to 12.9 billion US dollars expected losses to the economy. Multiply that by 17 or 18 to get the rand value. So that's a significant amount of economic downturn that we're going to experience due to load shedding. Now, also in 2023, during the 2023 State of the Nation address in February, President Cyril Ramaphosa announced a state of disaster on electricity, of course, in a bid to address the country's rolling blackouts. Now, the state of disaster essentially was supposed to give government additional powers to respond to this crisis, additional powers that include permitting emergency procurement procedures that obviously would have fewer bureaucratic delays and less oversight. But the state of disaster was again revoked in April 2020, early this month in April 2023. That was February. Now we move on to March. So in March 2023, the president appointed the Minister of Electricity, Dr. Ramaphosa. The new Minister of Electricity has been tasked to deal with the immediate crisis of load shedding. And he has political responsibility, authority, as well as control of the South Africa's Energy Action Plan, right? That comprises of interventions that have been developed by government to achieve energy security and effectively end load shedding by 2021. Now, this action plan is developed rather by the National Energy Crisis Committee. It was updated in January of 2023 and really focuses on key priority areas to try and fix the load shedding crisis that we have. Such interventions, just in a nutshell, include the acceleration of private investment, acceleration of procurement procedures, investment in rooftop solar for businesses and residential areas, as well as fundamentally transforming the electricity services industry. That was March 2023. We are in April 2023, and where are we now? Stage 8 of load shedding, effectively from the 13th of April 2023. Next slide, please, Lidile. Right, now, given the state of affairs that I've already just discussed, I want to also touch on the salient facts on international and national obligations that the country has currently, right? So it's not something new. It's not something that is new information that I'm giving. That approximately 85% of the country's electricity, which is about 42,000 megawatts, is generated via coal-fired power stations. Now, this is withstanding the commitments that South Africa has under the Paris Agreement that essentially seek to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that the country emits in various sectors, including the energy sector. Also, we need to be aware, as we have this conversation about the energy crisis, and I'm sure I'm anticipating quite a lot of questions about coal and renewables. We also need to keep at the back of our minds that during COP26, South Africa presented its revised NDC, that's the nationally determined contribution. Excuse me. The NDC with a practical plan to cut down on greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the revised NDC is part of the core of the revised NDC was essentially South Africa committing to an increased share of renewable energies, which was solar and wind, into the energy mix. And it also detailed Eskom's decommissioning schedule. So, Eskom essentially steadily laying out a plan of how it's going to move away from the over-reliance of coal that we have currently to, including more renewable energies into the country's mix. Now, based on the revised NDC in Glasgow, and during COP26, South Africa was able to secure 8.5 billion US dollars in investments through funding agreements that are committed really to supporting the decarbonization of South Africa's economy by developed countries. And this was, they accessed this kind of funding through the Just Energy Transition Partnership, right? So where do we intend to go? Recently, the minister announced that South Africa needs about 53 gigawatts of new generation, mostly from renewables, by 2032 in order to secure energy security. But to support this kind of generation, obviously, we need about 12,200 kilometers of transmission network that is still yet to be built, and this would cost about 372 billion over the next 12 years to finance and also invest into the national grid so that it is able to feed the base load from renewable energies into the main grid through transmission lines and to the end users. And currently, although we need this much by 2032, currently renewable energy only accounts to approximately 11% of the energy mix, which is about 2,600 megawatts. Now, I've been speaking about all of these things, and it sounds like it usually when you start a talk like this, you can see that I've touched on economics, I've touched on what needs to be done, the renewables that need to be added into the energy mix, which is more an engineering kind of conversation, to the grid, the technological aspects that affect the electricity services industry. And one usually gets the question, next slide, please, Lidile. What has the law got to do with it? Where does the law fit in all of this? Also, just a reminder that although the electricity services industry touches on various aspects, various fields, various disciplines, it also touches on the law still has a role to play. So I'm going to talk about the role of adaptive law generally before I test the role of adaptive law in the energy energy sector. Now, I'm going to rely on 4 arguments that scholars have advanced about the role of adaptive law in general before we really drill into the electricity services industry. Now, scholars have argued that the adaptive law and policy has to be, that is certain and inclusive, is one that drives development. So legislation and policy that speaks to whatever field, it has to be certain, it has to be clear, it shouldn't be confusing, it shouldn't be long-winded, it shouldn't be such that we have to constantly go to courts and ask for interpretation where we are stuck, right? It also has to be inclusive. What does that mean? It means that it has to be able to bring all stakeholders concerned to, there has to be processes in law to bring all relevant stakeholders in any field, in any community, in any sphere, to bring all these relevant stakeholders to the table. And there has to be processes that are to be followed on how decisions are made on giving a say to each and every stakeholder. Right, so legal and institutional coherence, right, which is also part of adaptive law, adds in fostering innovation. So what we're talking about here, the law, if the law is certain, right, it needs implementation partners, right? So we have various government departments in the energy sector that help to implement some of those laws. So there has to be institutional coherence because it's not one department that is tasked with implementing the implementation of all legislation in the ESI. So there has to be coherence. All those various departments have to speak to each other. They have to be conducting their competencies. They have to pull towards specific goals so far as the development of the ESI is concerned. And when there is that coherence, scholars have argued that that then opens up space, that then opens up possibilities for thinking outside the box, possibilities for innovation on how to solve various challenges that a particular field may be encountering. Adaptive law also includes rule of law that encourages in this field or in this sector, rule of law that encourages national as well as foreign direct investment. Sorry. So the question then scholars argue is there a respect for the rule of law, right? Is the law given effect to, right? So if the law is given effect to, then it becomes easier for the private sector, for example, for international development partners to come in and invest in a particular sector so that it can be developed. And one of my favorite arguments as well when it comes to adaptive law is that law is not static, right? So law has to, it's not frozen in time, right? So law has to be responsive to the changing needs of communities or countries, right? So law can't be frozen in 1998, right? Our law can't be frozen in 1998. It can't be frozen in 2003. It has to constantly evolve and it has to be responsive to the needs, changing needs of society. Thank you. Lidila, next slide, please. Now I'm going to touch on legislation and policy that is specific to ESI. Now in my doctoral study, I grouped, I had 3 groupings for legislation and policy, which I'll start with statutes. I'm not going to speak in turn about all of this, otherwise we'll be here for the whole day, but I'll just touch on salient aspects about legislation, policy, as well as regulations. Now, we have the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa, Section 24 of the Constitution, Section 24 of the Constitution that has a bearing on the ESI. We have the National Energy Act, which is a broader and overarching really framework of the energy sector in South Africa, with the National Energy Regulator Act that establishes the National Energy Regulator of South Africa, NESA, with the Electricity Regulation Act of 2006, that is the primary legislation that speaks to the ESI. We have the National Environmental Management Air Quality Act 39 of 2004. We also have the National Building Regulations and Building Standards Act of 103 of 1977. And most recently, although it's still a bill, hoping that it will be signed into legislation soon, the Climate Change Bill. Now, all of those statutes cover either the generation of electricity, its distribution, or its transmission, or all 3. I'll give you an example. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa would essentially deal with the generation of electricity, because it states in Section 24 that the generation, well, it doesn't say the generation of electricity, but in essence, the generation of electricity should be such that it does not violate your right to a healthy environment and so forth. The same applies with, for example, the National Environmental Management Air Quality Act that speaks to emissions, the standards of the emissions that are generated by essentially the generation of electricity, that it shouldn't emit beyond certain standards, and etc. Then you obviously have the Electricity Regulation Act that seeks to speak to all these facets, whether it's generation, whether it's distribution, or whether it's transmission. Then we also have the National Building Regulations as well, that speaks a lot to distribution, speaks a lot to energy efficiency and all of that. The Climate Change Bill, for example, that will generally speak to the generation of electricity, not so much its distribution and not so much its transmission, but all of these statutes, including the ESCOM conversion statute and stuff like that, they all speak and have a bearing on the ESI one way or the other. Next slide, please, Mr. Kwakwa. Now, legislation and policy that relates to the ESI. As far back, we have legislation and we have policy that dates as far back as 1998, right, with the white paper on energy of the Republic of South Africa, 1998. We have the free basic electricity pricing policy, We have the white paper on renewable energy policy of 2003. With the electricity pricing policy of 2008. We have the National Climate Change Response White Paper of 2011. We have the Framework for Short-Term Negotiated Pricing Agreements of 2008. We have the Integrated Resources Plan of 2009 that needs to be updated. And finally, we have the South Africa's Just Energy Transition Investment Plan 2023 that spans 5 years, 2023 to 2027. Now, all these policies, just like the statutes, have a bearing on the ESI. I'll give you an example of the white paper on energy of the Republic of South Africa. Now, this white paper is the one that essentially rang the alarm for what would happen if certain problems or certain challenges were not actioned. For instance, from this white paper, that's when, the alarm was rang to say the level of generation was essentially going to be outstripped by the supply, by the demand of electricity by 2008, right? It said in 10 years. And true to what it had predicted, it happened. But when we got to 2008, it said because of if there's no investment in the energy sector, if there's no new additional capacity into the ESI, it even suggested the unbundling of Eskom to try and transform the whole ESI. But because all of what the white paper had suggested to be done was never actioned for one reason or another, we find ourselves in 2008. We found ourselves in the situation that we found ourselves in, and because of other subsequent decisions, we are here today at stage 8 in 2023. The free basic electricity policy, for example, provides incentivizes the accessibility or affordability of electricity to indigent households. So all of this, one way or the other, feed into the ESI, and they're very strategic so far as the reduction of GHG emissions in our current energy mix. Next slide, please, Lidile. I also spoke about regulations. Now, these regulations usually operationalize the Electricity Regulation Act, and most of these regulations, I just list them down here, most of these regulations really speak to licensing, right? With the exception of Government Notice 109 of Government Gazette 4381 of October 2023, which essentially then opened up the ESI to local government and allowing local government to be able to either generate or procure their own electricity. Then the notice from 2009 was more a licensing exemption for licensing that IPPs that generated, I think, between 10 to 100 megawatts were exempt from certain determinations. So all of this still have a bearing, although yes, they operationalize the Electricity Regulation Act, but they also still have a bearing on the ESI and how it's going to develop moving forward. Next slide, please, Lidile. Now, I've spoken about statutes, I've spoken about policies, I've spoken about regulations. Then the question comes, are these adaptive in responding to the current crisis? Now, like I said, I'm going to take more pragmatic approach. So I'm also in discussing whether there's adaptive, I'm going to use the same arguments that I used at the beginning of the presentation, the general arguments. We're now going to apply them to the legislation and policy that we have. And I'm also going to just give you guys a few examples, practical examples of what we see happening on the ground in the ESI and how that has a bearing on the development of the ESI and effectively addressing the load shedding challenge that currently confronts South Africa. So first of all, the first argument was legal certainty and inclusivity. Now, our electricity laws that we have is electricity law and policy certain? Is it inclusive? So far as certainty is concerned, sorry. So far as certainty is concerned, my research showed that although there is a high degree of legal certainty, there are some very problematic sections in key legislation, like Section 34 of the Electricity Regulation Act, that speaks to a minister's power to be the one that determines the amount of additional new generation capacity that has to be added into the energy mix, and where the electricity to be generated is going to come from. My research also showed that there was a court case, the City of Cape Town court case, that was challenging this. Although the law is certain that it is the minister that has this capacity, it is the minister that is competent to say whether or not there is need for new generation capacity and where that capacity is come from. The law is clear on that, but doesn't mean that it is not being challenged, especially by local governments that feel the need or that are able to do more in the electricity services industry. So far as certainty, my research shows that there is legal certainty. Inclusivity, the research that I conducted showed that historically, the ESI has essentially been closed off to the local government, which is a sphere of government, right? So it hasn't been as inclusive historically. If you look at the Constitution, for example, local government are designated as reticulators. They're designated as distributors. If you look at the primary statutes that speaks to the electricity services industry, the Electricity Regulation Act also states that the competency of local government is to be a reticulator of electricity. It is only in 2023 through the which was also responsive, I'll speak about this later, which was also a responsive measure by national government, did we start to see local government being brought into the fold to say, is there a possibility of you as local government being able to do more? And what does that look like? That's why we had the regulations that I spoke about in the previous slide. So inclusivity, historically, no. We are seeing a shift in that, although then that makes the law a bit responsive to the changing needs, albeit late, but we're still getting there. Institutional coherence, the research that I conducted did find that on paper, there is institutional coherence. So in legislation is clear on government departments, on the role that they have to play, and on how they all contribute to one ESI. But in practice, that's not the case. I'll give you an example. I spoke previously about the 8.5 billion. So last year there was an instance where this 8.5 billion was obviously, sent to Treasury. Treasury then has to distribute it to all the departments that are working in the ESI in one capacity or another. So then there was an issue between Eskom and the Department of Trade and Industry, because a certain amount was allocated and Eskom wanted access to those funds, but also at the same time, the Department of Trade and Industry wanted access to the same funds. Eskom wanted access to those funds to invest in current coal plants and to also invest and engage in IPPs, whereas the Department of Trade and Industry wanted access to those funds to actually construct an electric vehicle. So there was an issue of institutional incoherence, although the funding was clear for what it was designed to do, which was to set South Africa on a decarbonization path. But then, because there is no coherence in the institutions that are working or that have a bearing on the ESI, it becomes difficult to demonstrate that level of coherence. The third argument spoke to the rule of law. Is there a rule of law? This one we can discuss during the question and answer section. I'll give you an example from the top of my head. Last year, Gwede Mantashe, the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources, was quoted, especially from as far as the Shell case. He continuously being quoted as saying that there's a Western agenda to get South Africa to abandon coal and to use renewable energies, and this is not going to be beneficial for the country's development, and etc. and etc. And more recently, I think about 2 days ago, the new minister of electricity was also heard uttering statements to the effect that he doesn't think that it is advised right now to invest money into grid development and transmission lines, because he thinks that money will be better spent being invested in existing coal plants. So is there a rule of law there? Are we respecting the law? Are we actually giving effect to the law when such statements are being uttered by key political figures in the ESI? The fourth argument was that adaptive law must be responsive to the changing needs of society. My research showed that the laws that we have in the electricity services industry are responsive, but they are lagging behind because so much is changing. It's changing at lightning speed, but then the law is taking longer to get to where we need to be, what needs to be happening in the ESI. So the laws are there, right, but they're not as responsive as we need them to be, because it's an industry. If you understand it, like I said before, it's not purely law, it's not purely legal. It's an industry that is heavily influenced politically, that has a significant bearing on us economically as well. So the law has to be up to date with all of those changes, and maybe even proactive in some instances. The involvement of local government into the ESI is something that a legislation that would have been proactive, would have been enacted before the current crisis that we are in, to actually now say local governments should come into the fold and try and play a more proactive role in order to address the current electricity crisis. I think I have the last slide, Lidile. Yeah, so I think I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening to my insights. I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to engaging with you. Please note that this work is presented in my personal capacity. It does not reflect the views of any institution or organization that I have been or am affiliated with. So all views and errors remain my own. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chantelle. And I think we are the ones who most enjoyed what you had to present today. It's clearly been a thought trigger, your presentation, as I see that already we have a comment/question in the chat, and I've seen a raised hand. Let me just double check that I see all the hands. So Kristen has a hand up. Before I get us to the Q&A part of the discussion, I would like to just extend orally also the invitation for anyone here. It's a safe space, and it's not a very large audience that you need to be scared of, to ask your questions or just to share some of your own experience or insights, to challenge Chantelle. She likes that very much. She's not scared of entering any arguments or to be convinced otherwise. And I think that takes me then to the question we first had, which was from you, Henry. And it basically centers around this idea of whether or not South Africans or people in South Africa have access to a right to electricity or to energy, and whether or not government has a duty to fulfill that right if it exists. And if you are of the opinion that actually there is an enumerated or other right to energy, what are the enforcement mechanisms available, what should be available, and how to remediate the situation where there is a reluctance or simply refusal on the part of government to fulfill that right. So it's a very broad question. You can perhaps touch on it on the basis of research that I know that you've done historically. But please do so in combination with the question that Kristen has. So Kristen, you are welcome to open your mic and to pose your question, and then we'll have Chantelle responding to both, and then I'll return to the chat for the next round of questions.
Am I audible? Thank you very much. That was a fantastic presentation. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. My question relates to investment for local municipalities specifically. We do see, I saw from your slides that you mentioned the regulations in relation to where the threshold for licensing has been increased from 1 megawatt to 100 megawatts. There's also changes in relation to procurement and generation. How can municipalities go about creating or entering a space where they can generate investment for renewable energy alternatives to get out from under the shadow of Eskom? Yeah, that's my question. Thank you very much.
Can respond, Chantelle?
Okay, Prof, I was waiting for you to give me the green light. Johanri's question around access and the right to electricity. This is, I think, a question that really centers on the work that we've done. I think he's here, if I'm not mistaken, but Dr. Felix Dube, the research that we conducted, and on that research, on that article, we did say that the right to electricity does exist. Though explicit, it could be read into some fundamental rights that are in the Constitution, like the right to housing, the right to dignity, and the right to food and water. We said that those rights, although it does put an obligation on government to progressively realize these rights are impossible to accomplish without access to electricity, right? So in as much as we don't have a section in the Constitution that everyone has a right to access to electricity, there are certain fundamental rights that cannot be realized without access to reliable electricity and affordable electricity as well. So investment for local government. Well, Chris, I think this one is a tough one because a lot of municipalities across the country owe Eskom billions of money in debt and outstanding debt. However, there is this new monster that we call mitigation finance. Under mitigation finance, then you have access to loans that could work for projects that seek to mitigate the impacts of climate change. That's where there's green finance, there's green bonds that local governments could apply to. I know, I think Sue was here. She could give us some insight with the city of Cape Town. I know they also had access to funding at some point. I think it was 3 point something from an international funding facility for their energy sector. I'm not too sure if she's here present. She can give us insights on that. But the international development finance is there. Climate finance is there that local governments can tap into, but obviously they have to show that they're in a position to be able to pay these loans, whether it's in concessional loans, whether it's in guarantees, etc. Whatever instrument, whatever facility is given to them, whether they can actually pay back, and whether the reason for the application for that kind of investment is is bankable, is it a bankable project, and etc. They have to show that they have the financial capacity to actually be able to service some of these loans. And unfortunately, across South Africa, when you take a look at the state of affairs for municipality and how they handle their finances, most of them would actually be disqualified before they can even try. So the facilities are there, international development finance is there, loans are there. Just have to show by the part of municipalities that they can service those facilities. Hope that answers your questions.
Thanks very much, Nonhlanhla. Kristen, if you would like to engage further, you can either do so in the chat or later on raising your hand. Chantelle, as you can imagine, this discussion will eventually move onwards to the whole question around the just energy transition and with a focus on renewables also. And so Cassius is asking in the chat, first of all, what do you think more or less about the new ministerial portfolio of electricity? Is it good? What's your thinking around that? Is it necessary or funds down the drain, possibly? And then he mentions that at COP27, 10 billion was pledged to help South Africa to cut its use of fossil fuels in the name of the just energy transition and so on. And he's asking, what do you think is holding back that actual transition? Is it a lack of political will or something else, perhaps? So you can reflect on that, but before you do so, I also have a question which has a risk of being theoretical, but I'm trying to keep it as practical as possible. Just taking us back to this whole idea of adaptive law, which I find curious, and I see that more and more academics talk about adaptive law and adaptation law, but these are two different things. But adaptive law, in the way that you've described it, emphasizes very much flexibility in law, and that we need to have a legal system capable of changing almost as fast as life is changing. And we all know that that happens incredibly fast at the moment. So I'm just practically thinking about the lawmaking process in our country, and you emphasize the need for inclusivity, etc. But all of that takes time. If you need to amend a law and go through all of the stages necessary to ensure that everyone has been included, and we talk about the private sector and different government spheres and line functionaries within those spheres, it's a long process. So are you suggesting perhaps that we need framework laws with principles, and then having the nuts and bolts in the regulations or norms and standards, for example, that is slightly easier to amend than the law itself? Because I'm worried that if we are constantly changing the law in the name of it being adaptive, that we might compromise certainty of the law, because yesterday this was the law and today this is the law, and especially I'm thinking from an industry perspective, it can be incredibly hard to comply when the law is as adaptive to just change to all changing circumstances. So I would like to have your view on that, and I'm abusing my position here, but it will be my last question, and then I'll give an opportunity to everyone else. We should also just perhaps bear in mind that the law around energy has implications for other areas of law. And one of the clear things that we battle with in South Africa is the fact that if we go for a system whereby municipalities will have less of a hand on electricity provision and distribution, it will definitely have an impact on its income, and that speaks to possible changes being necessary in municipal finance management law and a whole system of municipal income, especially our smaller and medium-sized municipalities. And then just 5 days ago, a general notice was issued whereby consultation is called on the government's intention to exclude the development and expansion of solar facilities from the requirements to obtain an EIA. And this is the other issue. All of us here today find ourselves amidst a global ecological crisis. And together with that, we sit with an energy crisis. And these two are not always compatible. And the law regulating these two crises may not necessarily be compatible, even more so when it's changing all of the time. So Chantelle, it was the input from Cassius, and it was my question. And then once you've responded, I'm coming back to Nonhlanhla, whose hand I've seen, and anyone else that, and Viandri, who had a comment. But you let us first deal with my input and that of Cassius.
Okay, Cassius, thank you so much for your question. The new ministerial portfolio, I don't want to be preemptive and say what I think about it, whether it's a waste of taxpayers' money. but I'd say let's give the guy a chance. But already I think yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, yesterday morning, there were reports that the president was asking the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources to cede some power to the new Minister of Electricity. We don't know what that looks like. We don't know what powers those are. It seems like we are just firefighting to try and figure out what works to address the electricity crisis that we find ourselves in. The 10 billion given also at COP 2027, and why the just energy transition is taking as long as it's taking. I don't know how long you think that is, but when you look at transition literature, especially from the global west, from the global north. If you look at transition literature, many countries actually started transitioning in the 1960s. All right, so the transition is not going to take 5 years. It's not going to take 10 years. And if we look at the just energy transition investment plan, you can see that it has to be it has to be done in phases, right? So it's not like we're going to get 10 billion today and tomorrow we'll wake up and we have 50% of our electricity mix, our energy mix being from renewables. It's not going to happen that quickly. Yes, we're in crisis. Yes, we need answers. Yes, we need solutions. But from history, from other countries that we can actually learn from that have transitioned in the global north, and they haven't really fully transitioned. And these are countries that have been deliberate about their transition from as early as the 1968s, the 1969s. They are still transitioning. And if you look at countries like Germany, countries like the United Kingdom right now, they're actually bringing online older plants to try and deal with the challenge that they themselves find themselves in this whole energy transition. So I think really the fundamental thing that needs to happen is to really understand what a just energy transition is, what it looks like, the context that we are in. We're in the global north, we're not in the global south. What happened to countries that have a record of transitioning that we can trace? How did they manage to do it? Is it something that are we able to follow the same trajectory of transitioning as African countries? And please, I hasten to say, when we talk about the just energy transition, we are not saying ban all coal. We're not saying that. We're just saying diversify the energy mix such that coal is not the primary source of electricity generation that we have. Let's add more resources that are less polluting, like coal is. And we're also saying, let's honor the international obligations that South Africa actually agreed on at an international level. If that wasn't possible, then South Africa wouldn't have agreed to assume some of these obligations. Prof, difficult question. Adaptive law, I think that the nugget that you put in your question kind of like helps me to answer the question of, are we going to, in a bid to have responsive laws, are we going to change laws? If it's in the electricity service industry, for example, because things are changing so fast, we would have changed 4 or 5 times. We'd have changed the ERA 4 or 5 times. So I think, as you said in us asking your question, that maybe we should have a framework legislation that would then have certain principles that can be a mind map to especially regulations, because then, like you say, correctly pointed out, those would be easier to update, those would be easier to actually promulgate and pronounce, less than changing an entire law that speaks to, for example, the ERA, that speaks to the generation, regulation, and distribution, which are completely different monsters on their own, although they intertwine. The revenue structure of local government, and I think we could have a whole conversation about this and spend the whole afternoon here. My research did show last year when I conducted the PhD that the revenue structure of local government as a whole, whether it's a category A, B, or C, is going to be affected by this role that we are inviting local governments to be a part of. Remember, we are not saying we are opening the possibility of local governments, we're opening the possibility of municipalities that feel like they can be able to contribute or to play a more proactive role in the ESI to actually come forward and if you look at the regulations also, which I did in last year, there are conditions that a local government has to meet in order to be able to get consideration as either a procurer or a generator of electricity. So essentially doing away with the one seller, with the single buyer model. So literally having local governments being able to purchase their own electricity from IPPs. So it's no question. There has to be, for future researchers, maybe this could be a potential topic, considering the revenue structure of local government and what the implications that the electricity crisis has on that. And there's a lot to unpack as well, considering the amounts that are owed to Eskom by these local governments. What are we saying when we open this up to them, to giving them essentially more responsibility than they have been failing to fulfill? EIA, I saw that as well, but I think, like I said, we are firefighting. We know that the process of getting an EIA approved is a long one as well, can be a long one, with various reports that have to be submitted. So I think in an effort to cut out on the bureaucracy, we are, in some instances, digging ourselves into a deeper hole, because these are also considerations that, I know yourself, Professor Fu, have done quite a lot on in terms of environmental protection, EIAs, their place and, their role in development and so forth. So we essentially risk a possibility of reverting to instances where we were complaining about EIAs not being done, or EIAs not being given effect in developmental projects. I hope I answered those questions to your satisfaction.
You did. Thank you, Chantelle. I'm going to ask that Nonhlanhla open her mic and pose a question, and then I'm going to bring you back to the what I have in the chat, input from Ramabaga and from Vihandri. But in the meantime, Nonhlanhla, you can ask your question.
Thank you very much, Prof. I hope I'm audible. Mine is going to be very quick, because Chantelle, in the last part of you answering Prof's questions, you really then touched on my interest, and that was really on the powers and functions of local government alone. But then now the last part, at least, of my question would be on the regulations that we speak of, where local government is now able to generate, I suppose, electricity. My question is, do these regulations come after what we've seen happening in Cape Town? Is it did they come before? I don't know. You're the master in this field, and I'm asking this because I'm actually thinking, was what happened in Cape Town because of local government laws, the powers that they have? Were they innovative enough to use them, or was it political will? What do you think drove the city of Cape Town, basically, for them to be able to say, listen, we are going to respond, we are going to also start generating electricity amidst, of course, what you've outlined is possible and not possible in terms of energy law? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nonhlanhla. So Chantelle, I'm trying to paraphrase the input from Ramabaga, and it actually also speaks to Vihandri's question, and it really is about this idea of we need to be able to change the law as circumstances demand. So Vihandri, in essence, would like to know what kind of changes. Is it social, economic, environmental? What kind of changes? And I suppose that actually speaks to impacts as well. And Ramabaga is saying that change is happening fast, and yes, it might be that the law is not responding fast enough, even though it is responding. But isn't this an ever continuing process of change and amend and change and amend? And is it even possible to say that the law, as opposed to other things, must be able to act fast? And yeah, pardon the pun, that reference to act. Chantelle, you can respond, and then I would like to ask anyone else that's still got a question or just an input, more than welcome to raise your hand while Chantelle is responding. Thanks, Chantelle.
Okay, thank you, Nonhlanhla. Thank you, Viliandri and Romahoba, I think. Sorry if I butchered your name. Regulations to generate or procure, did I come before or after Cape Town? So those that don't know, what happened is Cape Town, the city of Cape Town took the Minister of Energy and NESA to court, and they were challenging the constitutionality of Section 34 of the Electricity Regulation Act, right? So when you read the case, that was the reason why they went to court. But because of that case, other things came into play, because Cape Town was alleging that if this section is saying that it's only the minister that can determine whether or not we need additional generation capacity, one, and two, the section goes on to say it is the power of the minister to determine where that additional capacity will come from, right? Meaning it is the minister that has the power to say, we need 100 megawatts more into the grid, right? And he also has the power to say, out of this 100 megawatts, 20 megawatts should come from wind. 20 megawatts can come from solar, or he can essentially say additional generation capacity, all of the 100 megawatts is going to come from coal. So that was what they were challenging. So City of Cape Town was essentially saying, because this electricity is going to be consumed in Cape Town, the city had a right to choose itself where their electricity came from. Then the conversations around Section 24 came into play. The conversations about renewable energy, the just energy transition also came into play. But the reason why they went to court was to essentially challenge the constitutionality of Section 34. However, when this court was litigated, it was found to be an intergovernmental dispute, right? Because, like I said, other factors came into play. Factors like, did the departments speak to each other? Did the City of Cape Town engage with the minister? What was the extent of their engagement? Did they engage with NESA? What was the extent of that engagement? So the court essentially didn't comment on the constitutionality of that particular act or that particular section of the act. But it just threw the matter back at the parties to try and figure out it out as an intergovernmental dispute. The regulations, Nonhlanhla, came just a few months after that. So whether one is to say the case influenced government to look to act in that particular manner or not, that would be speculative. But the regulations did come after the conclusion of the act, although it was significantly close. It was, I think, a month or a month and a half, going to 2 months, thereabout. What kind of changes are we looking at? Leandria, I'll give you the example of the regulations that we have right now. State of the Nation Address 2020, the president actually said, in order to respond to the crisis that we find ourselves in, we are considering bringing local government into play in the electricity services industry. So when you say what kind of changes are you looking at, this was purely a generation kind of solution to say, the electricity that we're generating is not enough for the demand that we have, right? So in order to address the solution, we need additional generators. We need more electricity. This is the solution. We need more electricity. Where does it come from? Who generates it? So I can't say that every change will be social, it will be economical, it will be political. I think the change would obviously be responsive to the challenge that the country faces at that time. And right now, if you look at it, The challenge that we face is there is a huge gap between what we're generating and what we need. Right, there's a huge gap what is being generated and what industry needs, what is being generated and what residences need. That's why we have then these rolling blackouts, because the supply of the electricity is just so low. There's a huge gap. How do we cover the gap? Right, when we talk about when in the electricity services industry, covering the gap means we're generating more electricity, so we need more electricity to be generated. What does the law say? Then we start thinking around what needs to change in the law, what needs to be facilitated to ensure that, various stakeholders are able to generate electricity at a quicker pace to meet the demand that is there. Ramahoba, I think I'll give you a political answer. I think we need to be asking our question, who makes the law? We need you guys that have this information, scholars, to be the ones that actually either influence or talk about policy reform or advocate for policy reform so that this information gets to the right ears in terms of the lawmaking process. Because the law as it is, the truth of the matter is it's not responsive enough. It's not responsive as quick enough. So we need legislators to also think innovatively, to also be forward thinking and not only be responsive, waiting for things to happen, then respond to it. Because the electricity services industry is a perfect example of that happening, and how in trying to firefight and trying to manage a crisis, we find ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper in crisis. Whereas back in 1998, when the white paper on energy was released, if there were forward-thinking political figures or forward-thinking lawmakers, they would have sat down and said, listen, how do we attract investment into the ESI? Right? Because that was one of the reasons that the white paper rang as a flashing red light, as this needs to happen as early as tomorrow, as early as yesterday. But why was that? Why was it that the lawmakers did not have the foresight to even think of the possibility? Yes, electricity was cheap. We were coming from the energy, minerals energy complex where mining was in a boom. Electricity was cheap. Everybody was, enjoying it. But if we had forward-thinking legislators that we're not waiting to be responsive to to crises, if we had forward-thinking legislators, they would have said, listen, this is well and good right now, but it won't last forever. How do we attract investments into the ESI that we have today, and how do we develop it gradually before we even got to the crisis that we got to in 2008? I think I could speak the whole day, but I think I managed to answer some of those questions that were given.
Thank you, Chantelle. For now, I don't see any other raised hands or comments other than compliments in the chat. Listening to you, and I should be cautious in saying this because I'm sitting here wearing the hat of a lawyer, legal scholar myself. But I think we should also be realistic about the fact that the law and policy is only what it does, and it's limited in terms of what it can do. There's a lot of responsibility also lying in the hands of executives and decision makers, politicians. And we should probably, when we have this discussion, also bear that in mind, that there's the implementation question, and there are certain things for which the law might not be good, where we need other forms of intervention or regulation, because the law, as you said right at the beginning, is static, and I'm standing to be convinced that the law will ever be the kind of adaptive thing that you argue for, even though it would have been wonderful, but that's not how the law globally has been designed to work. It's all about rules and regulations, and you know where I'm getting at. So perhaps at a future occasion, we can also speak about other possibilities for intervening through classic and quasi-legal interventions, if you can call it like that. And then, of course, there's also, I think, a deficit in law regulating this fast inclusion of new role players and what we effectively see to be the privatization of energy generation in the country. I mean, we're far from being there yet, but there's a lot of people generating their own electricity nowadays. Anyone who's thinking that it will be a missed opportunity if I don't raise my hand now, I realize that there might be people here that's shy, and we will not be shy to share Chantelle's email address afterwards for anyone interested in chatting with her offline. And Chantelle, that leaves me, first of all, with asking whether or not you have any last remarks. Okay, let me stop there. Any last remarks from your end?
Just thank you, Prof. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to you guys for engaging on the research that was very contentious the time I was at CLES, and I enjoyed the ride, all of it. And thank you also for the questions. And I think just a few thoughts, a few final thoughts. I mean, the solutions, I always say this to my counterparts at CLES, the solutions are out there. We have the solutions. There's no harm in us writing and being proven wrong until we get to the answer. So, it's a mammoth, it's a problem, it's a crisis. Yes, it is. But the answers are here with us. Let's continue researching, let's continue writing, let's continue being proven wrong, let's continue proven right. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chantelle, for those encouraging last words, and I fully agree with you. And that leaves me with just once again saying thank you very much. We will definitely follow your career. It's a bright one ahead. I'm sure about that. And yeah, please continue working in this area. We don't have enough people in South Africa doing research on energy law, not nearly enough. And you are one of those who didn't shy away from the topic. And I hope that you will continue working in this field. And for everyone who's so actively engaged with the discussion or just sat back and listened and learned today, thank you very much as well. And please be sure to join us for a next critical conversation or to visit here at CLES if you like. And I wish you all a very happy afternoon, and that the load shedding schedule will be kind to you with the temperatures dropping fast lately. All right, everyone, good afternoon further, and thank you to the CLES team who's made today possible. Goodbye.